Turning Point Talks presents Ellen H. Brown's Web of Debt.
So welcome everybody. Here we are in Mullumbimby, Australia. It's the 1st of November 2020 and it's just 3 days before the American election, and Turning Point Talks is delighted to have Ellen Brown, one of America's foremost alternative economists, coming to speak to us today. So Ellen is an advocate of financial reform, especially public banking. She's also an attorney, an author, a public speaker, and an activist. She is the founder and president of the Public Banking Institute, a nonpartisan think tank devoted to the creation of publicly run banks, an idea that all of us here very much support. Ellen is also an advocate of alternative medicine and has written several books on that topic. And all of us here also are very much into alternative medicine. I believe you live in California and you have 2 books out on finance. One is called The Web of Debt, The Shocking Truth About Our Money System and How We Can Break Free. And the other is The Public Bank Solution, From Austerity to Prosperity. So today, Ellen's talk and her PowerPoint presentation is on the topic, Taming the Money Power, a great topic, Ellen. So over to you. Thank you so much for zooming into us here all the way from California.
Okay, thank you, Fatima. It's great to see you all there. Actually, I have 3 books on money reform. The third one, my latest, is called Banking on the People, which I go into how we can reform the system, or how I would suggest. Okay, I'm going to do my PowerPoint. Hopefully I'll manage to get this up correctly. Okay, taming the money power. It didn't, there we go. Okay, so we're living in crisis times, as we all know, and we do need a reset of some sort. We've got shuttered local businesses, millions of people are unemployed, public revenues are down, public costs are up, civil unrest has been going on, and we anticipate more because of the upcoming election, and debt is way up in all sectors. In fact, we had a debt crisis before this year, going back at least to 2008, 2009. This is U.S., of course, this is a U.S. chart. So we never really fixed the problem we had 10 years ago. And typically, when you have currency resets, it is after one of these debt crises. So here's a chart of debt held by the public, by government, in other words, of the U.S. So our first debt crisis would be after the American Revolution, when we went heavily into debt, and then that reset was the First U.S. bank, the second U.S. bank under Alexander Hamilton, where he basically just issued sovereign credit, which is what I recommend. And then, well, the second U.S. bank was 1816. You can see there was actually, it was after the War of 1812. And then Jackson shut down the second U.S. bank, and we went through a period of depression, actually, because there was no money system. We had no money, no national currency. And we only had banker issued banknotes. I can go into that later. But anyway, so then we had the Civil War, which obviously was another debt crisis. Lincoln would have had to borrow from British bankers at 30% interest. So instead, he issued greenbacks, which was another currency reset, issued money, government issued money directly, and set up a new national banking system. And then we went through another recession, and we had World War I. And after that was the Bank for International Settlements. I'll go into that later too. Then we had the Great Depression, World War II. Then we had the Bretton Woods reset, where it was supposedly gold backed, but it was really dollar backed. And then Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Then we went into oil backed dollar, and Then we had the 2008, 2009 crisis, and now we have debt going up, up, up. So we do need to do something, but the proposal that's currently on the table, the Great Reset, is proposed by the World Economic Forum. It's really not what we want, and it covers a lot more than just money. The World Economic Forum is the Davos set, those 3,000 or so business leaders and political leaders who meet in Davos, Switzerland every year, every January, I think. It was founded by Klaus Schwab, I think. I can't even see my own PowerPoint. Who was a former member of the steering committee of the Secretive Bilderberg Group linked to the New World Order. And they've got this very complex system laid out on their website. And this is just one page of it. You can click on any of those things and you'll find many more little spidery things going out that they've worked it all out. But the main thing, they're planning to hit food and jobs and medicine, business, virtually everything, global financial cooperation. And probably the biggest one is the fourth industrial reset, which you could, or sorry, fourth industrial revolution, which you can see there. This was all written up in a book by Klaus Schwab. So the first industrial revolution was when we went from labor, physical labor, manual labor to machines. Then we had the technological revolution, and then the digital revolution at the end of last century. And the fourth is the connecting all those digital things with everything physical. Like everything physical will have a will be connected, and everything, including everything living. That's the plan. I mean, they don't get too specific, but you can read a lot of other places where it seems they want to hook us individually up to this whole system too, possibly with something that they implant right into the coming vaccines. I don't want to get too far into that. But the thing is, it's all digital. And then just recently, the IMF, which is also part of that network, proposed a new Bretton Woods, which would also be all digital, basically based on a network of central bank digital currencies. So different commentators have criticized this. One is T.P. Wilkinson, who called it the pharma dollar, because we were on the gold-backed dollar, and then Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard globally. And then we had what was called the petrodollar, where Nixon and Henry Kissinger made a deal with the OPEC countries that they would sell their oil only in dollars, US dollars. And now that's pretty much has been broken. So the next will be backed by drugs and vaccines, who are, the race for the vaccine. Martin Armstrong calls it the elitist coalition to redesign the world. Matt Ehret calls it a system of supranational technocratic controls under a banker's dictatorship. Pepe Escobar calls it a technocratic digital dystopia, digital neo-feudalism, algorithm gobbling up politics. So we do need a reset. And it's true that crises are an opportunity, or we need to treat it as an opportunity. But we need one that serves the people. And the problem with the Great Reset is it omits everything democratic and individual human rights, representation by the people, for the people. So we want technology, and we actually need a banking system, but we need banks that serve the people rather than enslaving them. And so to explain how I think this can be done, first I want to go into some financial history, basically where our whole money system comes from and what it's based on today, and how we could capture that for the public interest. So as it's usually taught in economics class, it is thought that money originated from barter, where one farmer might have eggs and another farmer might have milk, and they would trade. But both those things are perishable. Maybe you don't want milk or eggs for your your goods at the market. So gold and metal coins came along as something that was non-perishable, that could be a medium of exchange. And then we went from there to paper money issued privately. So this is entirely a private system. Then from paper money to plastic cards to electronic money. And in this chart, it goes to cryptocurrency, but I'm not really going to get into that. But in fact, as Michael Hudson has shown in his book, And Forgive Them Their Debts, money and banking actually originated as a public system. It was a government run. It was actually a theocracy going all the way back 5,500 years to ancient Sumeria. So it was the temple and the king who had the power to control currencies and who set up this whole system. And the Sumerians were they had some remarkable education from somewhere. I mean, if you look historically, the civilization before them were basically Neanderthals. I mean, they were living in huts, and then all of a sudden you had these very complex cities. By 3600, the Sumerians had invented the wheel, they had invented writing, the sailboat, irrigation, and the concept of the city. And where did all that come from? According to their own cuneiform writings, which they don't consider to be like a Bible, like religion, this was their history. This is what they said they had been taught, which was that this all came from the gods. It's not really clear who the gods were, maybe arguably extraterrestrials, we don't know, who supposedly genetically manipulated humans to turn us into serfs of the gods. And why I think this is interesting, first of all, that it was a public system and not a private system, it's top down from government. And second of all, because arguably we may be I mean, I don't want to go too far into this, but it is interesting. It's possible that it's the same deep, whatever influences that are attempting to enslave us again. So the Sumerian written language began as a system of accounts to manage the workers. And there were, many, many workers that had to build all these things. And these accounting systems just set up who owed what to whom. And a major advantage of this system, so credit was issued by the temple at relatively high interest rates. So you were supposed to pay your tithe to the temple. You got your piece of land, but you had to pay a tithe for it. And if you had a bad crop year, you could pay later, but interest rate was 30%, which was actually very high. And it stayed that way for like 1,000 years. But because the system was controlled, because the lender was the government or was the temple and was the king, they were able to fix these problems of debt accumulation with periodic debt jubilees. So the king could just periodically, when they had some sort of a war or something, he would write off all the debts. And every time they had a new king, they would write off all the debts. So there were periodic debt jubilees to set the record back to zero. And that worked for 2,000 years and was quite stable for 2,000 years until money and credit were privatized. And, of course, Jesus threw the money lenders out of the temple when the bankers became the originators of money and credit. So today what we have is a debt system, and debt has been called the new serfdom, the new means of enslavement to moneyed powers. So the debt builds up, and instead of having debt jubilees, eventually it gets too high, and then the whole system collapses. And anyone who's got money left then buys up all the assets. Like right now, the small businesses have collapsed, and the big businesses or the big money, the big investors can go in and buy up the little businesses, and basically they wind up owning everything, and the result is homelessness and poverty. But in the U.S., we also started out with a public money system, not a private system. The American colonists didn't want to be taxed, and they really didn't have any money. They didn't have gold. It's not like there was a bank on every corner. And so in 1694, the governor of Massachusetts was fighting a little border war, and he couldn't find anyone to borrow from. So he got the idea of just printing out these little paper receipts, paper script, that were supposedly an advance against taxes. But it was a lot easier to issue the paper script than to collect the taxes from these frontiersmen who were kind of hard to pin down and didn't like being taxed. So there was the problem that they tended to inflate the system, like they would print more than they managed to bring back. But in Pennsylvania, they came up with a more sustainable solution where it was called a land bank, where this is Benjamin Franklin's colony. And what the land bank would print the money, just like all the colonists were doing, but instead of just spending it out there, the government would lend it to the farmers at 5% interest, which was a better rate than the Bank of England was charging. And they didn't have access to the Bank of England anyway. So the government would, this is just my little hypothetical, but say you could print $105, lend $100 at 5% interest, spend the $5 on things the colony needed, and then you'd have $105 out there. So you'd have the money to pay the interest. So it would all come back $105 as principal and interest. You could lend it all over again, spend it all over again. So it was a quite sustainable system that worked very well. But in Europe, they evolved a different system. The goldsmiths were taking people's gold and giving them paper banknotes for it. So it was also a paper system, but these banknotes were supposedly backed by gold. But the goldsmiths quickly figured out that they could lend like 10 times as many banknotes as they actually had gold. So 9 out of those 10 notes were essentially counterfeit. And so it was privately issued paper money. And that model was adopted with the Bank of England when the king needed money for a war, and the privately owned Bank of England would set up so that it was basically the private bankers who were creating the currency, and the king was essentially renting it from the private bankers at interest. Excuse me. So we had our paper script system that worked quite well until the Bank of England leaned on King George to forbid it. And the result was it totally collapsed our money supply. And so the result was the American Revolution, because it resulted in depression and we didn't have money for trade. So then we had our first U.S. reset, which was the First U.S. Bank, where the bank actually took the state's debts and turned them into a form of capital, but paid the debts, but using the Bank of England system, where the bank issued many more banknotes than it actually had gold, like at about 10 to 1. But these were banknotes issued by the U.S. government, so it was a public currency. But President Jackson shut down the second U.S. bank, and there was no national currency for several decades until Lincoln came along, and then he issued greenbacks directly. So this was like returning to the script system, paper script system of the American colonists. And he set up a national bank system, but I won't go into that. So anyway, he was assassinated, the greenbacks were discontinued, silver was demonetized, and again, the money supply shrank and we went into another depression. This generated a greenback movement, and the first ever march on Washington in 1894 was a march all the way from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to attempt to get the government to return to greenback, Lincoln's system of just issuing the money directly in order to, Jacob Coxey was the head of this march, and his two proposals were to have a good roads bill where you would just issue the money and do internal improvements. And there was another bill that would basically just issue money. One of them helped the farmers and one of them helped the workers. And this was apparently the basis of the Wizard of Oz. I mean, it's the strange story in the Wizard of Oz of these four, not even necessarily people, marching off to Oz, the capital city, seeking redress for their problems. And the wizard turned out to be just a little man behind a curtain. But he did tell them that they had the power to solve their own problems, including with Dorothy could get back home by clicking her. They were called ruby slippers in the movie, but they were actually silver slippers in the book. So basically by remonetizing silver and issuing government issued money, basically. So we could also do that today, but I'll explain that more. So anyway, but we were in a depression and we didn't go back to the Coxey's army was turned away in Washington, D.C. at the door, weren't allowed in. And then we had an even bigger banking crisis, and that precipitated the passing of the Federal Reserve Act. And instead of being a public bank, as William Jennings Bryan wanted, who was then the populist leader, it reverted to the system of the Bank of England, where it was basically composed of 12 Federal Reserve branches, all of which are 100% owned by the banks in their districts. So it's really a public-private partnership at best. But meanwhile, in Australia and some of the other British colonies, the British colonies had broken away physically and gotten their independence, but the City of London was retaining control through the banking system by keeping them in debt. And so the Commonwealth Bank of Australia actually preceded the Federal Reserve, and it was a public bank serving the nation and the people by just issuing sovereign credit, national credit. And with that, it was Dennis Miller was the first governor, and with that sovereign credit, he did a great deal of development across the country and funded Australia's participation in World War I. And that worked very well. And other countries did the same, New Zealand and Canada, a bit later. But Dennis and Miller made the mistake of going to the City of London after World War I and boasting that Australia had succeeded in doing all this without borrowing from the city, which, was not well approved of by the City of London. So the Bank of England came up with with the central banking system, basically a international central banking system. So a new plan was devised, a system of central banks that would take over the power to issue national currencies, which would be lent to the government and the people. And the apex of the system originally was to be the Bank of England. But after World War I, the Bank of England, didn't have the finances to manage all this itself. So it joined with 3 other central banks to form the Bank for International Settlements. And this was from Professor Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, which was written in 1966. But Carroll Quigley said he was an insider, that he had been entrusted with all this data from these big financiers. And he wrote, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans. So one example, major example, the Bank of Canada had its own public bank, a central bank that the government borrowed from 1939 to 1974. So basically the central bank was issuing the money, and they did a number of remarkable projects, including funding their universal health care system and their Trans-Canada Highway, et cetera, funded with the Bank of Canada right up until 1974. And then the government quit borrowing from its central bank. And then you can see what happened to their federal debt. It just shot up. So by 2000, the federal debt had shot up to $585 billion. Between 1961 and 2006, the Canadian government paid over twice its debt just in interest. So you might ask what changed in 1974. That was when Canada joined the Basel Committee of the Bank for International Settlements, which was formed that year. And the committee had as one of its objectives to maintain the stability of the currency. Well, that was said to mean that you didn't want to inflate your currencies by allowing the government or the central bank, by allowing the government to issue the money directly or borrow directly from its central bank, which would issue the money, and that this would, theoretically create too much currency out there and inflate the system. But obviously it didn't in the case of Canada and many other examples. And the presumption was that, so the government was supposed to borrow on the private market, the open market, but the presumption was that they would therefore be borrowing existing money and not borrowing money that was just created. But in fact, all the money in the open market, 90% of the money supply is actually created by banks when they make loans. And this was confirmed by the Bank of England in 2014 in their quarterly report, where they said, contrary to popular belief, banks do not act simply as intermediaries lending out deposits the savers place with them. Commercial banks actually create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. And in fact, they said 97% of the amount of money currently in circulation was created by banks when they made loans. So the way they do it is, if you go to the bank to buy, let's say you want a loan to buy a house, the bank will just write that $500,000 for the loan into your account, and it just, it appears magically, digitally in the bank ledger. And so they'll write it as an asset to themselves on one side of their books, because you're going to pay that back over time with interest. And they write it as a liability to themselves, because when you pay your seller, if your seller's in another bank, they're going to have to come up with the reserves under the federal U.S. system anyway, where they have to move reserves from one bank to another, which would have been gold like in the 19th century until we got the Federal Reserve. And then the Fed set up a system where they create bank reserves, and you got to move these bank reserves from one to another. So the bank says, well, it all comes out to zero, 500 plus, 500 minus, that comes to zero. And so let's assume two different banks are doing the same thing, and Bank A gets a $500,000 deposit from Bank B, which just did the same thing. So they both get $500,000 in that was created by the other bank, and $500,000 goes out, their books balance, but $1 million has just been created out of nothing. And that's where our money supply comes from. And you can see by this chart that most money is created by banks as loans, because the money created by the government is that blue line. This is US, of course, is that blue line all the way at the bottom. And what is that red line? M2, that is created somewhere else. It's created by the banks. So what's wrong with the system? First of all, it puts private bankers in control, obviously. I just thought this was quite good. It was the credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in 1934, when we were in deep depression. He said, we are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If we not, we starve. Robert Hemphill is his name. So that's one problem. Another is the basic math. If banks are creating the money, they create only, or creating it as loans, they create only the principal, they don't create the interest. So where's that interest going to come from? You always have more money owed back than was created in the first place. So the result is that debt always grows faster than the real economy. And that's clearly not sustainable. It's a pyramid scheme. The only way you can get the money to pay the interest is somebody somebody has to borrow more. So you just have more and more debt supporting the lenders at the top. And as we know, indefinite growth is unsustainable. It's also why we have this growth imperative where everything has to grow and create new profits and so forth. And then we have what's called the business cycle, as if it was a natural phenomenon like the weather, but it really wouldn't have to be this way, where debt gets too high and then it collapses. So this was what was fixed in ancient Mesopotamia with debt jubilees, but we can't do that today because the lenders are private banks and they're just not going to go along with it. They'll be taking the government to court. So how can we fill the gap between debt and the income available to pay it? Ben Bernanke said it was easy to create this, you would call this a debt deflation, where the money supply is, there's not enough money to pay off the debt, that the money supply is shrinking. He said it's easy to cure a debt deflation. He said you just fly over the people and drop money on them. And that is considered the origins of quantitative easing, but quantitative easing doesn't really work that way, but I won't go too much into detail there. But anyway, the obvious objection is, well, but that's going to be inflationary because you're, you know, if you've got too much money chasing the same amount of goods, it's going to drive prices up. But that didn't happen in China, for example. In China, for 23 years, going right up to, I think this chart goes up to, I can't see there, but 2018. So for 23 years, the Chinese M2 money supply grew by 18%. In other words, 18 times, it was 18 times what it started out as. That's the top chart. And the inflation rate stayed level, basically level, or actually dropped a bit during that whole period. So why was that? It was because goods and services, because they were using the money for productive purposes. So the amount of commodities out there to buy with the money went up at the same time that the money went up. So the prices remained the same. So if you have like $1 to buy one widget, the price is going to be $1. And if you have $100 to buy 100 widgets, the price is still going to be $1. In other words, you just got to use the money to make widgets and it'll balance out. And we can see that also with Lincoln's greenbacks, where he printed $450 million worth of greenbacks, actually doubling the money supply. So if we did that today, we'd be adding like $15 trillion to the money supply, which they would totally freak out Congress. You know, they'd say this is going to be totally inflationary, but it wasn't. There was a bit of inflation, but it was considered wartime inflation. We always have inflation in wars because there are shortages, and everybody would rather have gold than the paper money of a somebody, somebody's at my door. Anyway, they'd rather have gold than the paper money of a country or somebody that might not win. So that money, oh dear, with that money with the money created, the greenbacks created. Oh dear, I can't go to the door. It's my neighbors, but they're gonna sit there and keep knocking. So with that money, they created the Transcontinental Railroad, which actually turned a profit, a 60% profit for the government. So it was a very good deal. And there you can see it didn't create inflation. This is inflation over that period. And where the inflation rate actually went up was in the 1980s and 1990s when we had banking deregulation. So another reason that the Chinese prices didn't inflate is that they are big savers. So it's not like when they got some money, they would rush out and buy stuff with it. They would save it. And so it didn't drive up the money supply. Now, the savings rate today is obviously very low. There are a lot of people that are out of work. So if you showered them with, let's say you gave them a universal basic income of $1,000 a month or something, they're not going to rush out and buy trinkets with their $1,000. They're going to save it for an emergency, which many families don't have now. I mean, many families don't even have a roof over their head, but they're certainly going to at least only spend it on essentials. And if they can afford to save it, they will. And they will pay down debt if they can. Like if they've got credit card debt at 20% interest or something, they're certainly not going to keep paying 20% interest if they've got the money to pay that off. So money is created as a debt. It's extinguished when the debt is paid off. So this would also prevent inflation from something like a universal basic income. So there's plenty of room to increase the money supply for public purposes without creating inflation. We could use this extra money for infrastructure, which we desperately need right now, that we've got things pretty much falling apart. We could use it for the environment. We could use it for something like a universal basic income or dividend or stimulus checks or unemployment checks. We could use it for Medicare for all or student debt relief, et cetera. Many possibilities. And if we did like the Chinese, we could pump in multiple times, what we've already pumped into without creating inflation. So the Chinese actually don't do it by the government issuing the money directly. If they want to build, well, they did build 12,000 miles of high-speed rail in a decade. Now, how did they do that? Where did they get the money? They owned 80% of banking assets. The government does. So the infrastructure bank, they could just borrow from their own big infrastructure bank. I think they're the biggest infrastructure bank in the world, which creates the money on its books, like all banks do. And they go out, pay the workers of materials, and then the fees generated by the thing they built with this money pay off the loan. So everything, balances out, and they don't have inflation, and they do have a train that they didn't have before. And also because the government owns the 80% of banking assets, they can and do write off debt. They don't put the debtors into foreclosure or bankruptcy, and they don't put the banks into bankruptcy. They just let these non-performing debts ride on their books, and it works because it's a publicly owned banking system. So another possibility then is to have public infrastructure banks rather than something like greenbacks, which we certainly haven't persuaded our Congress to do, but they wouldn't necessarily be opposed to setting up an infrastructure bank of the sort that Roosevelt rebuilt the entire country with. So it was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was set up by the previous president, Hoover, not even for that purpose, but Roosevelt took it over and greatly expanded it. So that it had a very modest capitalization outlay from Congress of $500 million. And with that, they managed to create $40 billion that was used for what were called self-funding loans, things like railroads that generate fees, or dams or farms or whatever, anything productive that could pay back was funded through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And it funded the U.S. or much of the U.S. participation in World War II and all the industrial development that we did during that time. And with all that outlay, not only did it not cost the government anything, there was actually a net profit to the government of $690 million. And there's a bill on that right now that I like a lot called HR 6422 that would do the same thing. I mean, you don't care about it. That's an American bill, but that could be done. In other words, if you can't get your Congress to issue money directly, which you probably can't, then you can probably tuck them into a bank on that model, because we've had such banks before and they worked very well. And if we can't get it, any action on the federal level, we can also do it at the state local level. We have a quite vibrant public banking movement going right now. I'm chairman of the Public Banking Institute, and that's what we do, is trying to get public banks set up across the country. We only actually have one. Well, so globally, this is a quite popular model. We've only got one in the US, but globally, 25% of banking assets are publicly owned. I should change that chart. The Bank of North Dakota has been around for 100 years. It was also the product of the populist movement, the same one that attempted to get the Greenbacks reinstituted, and that didn't work. The William Jennings Bryan failed at his attempts, but in North Dakota, they did manage to set up this public bank, and they set up a public granary. They managed to, it was called the Nonpartisan League, was a political party saying they're not left, they're not right, they're just for the people, or for North Dakota, for the local economy. And I started writing about it in 2008 because I knew they were the only state that had their own bank. So I was watching it, and it turned out it was the only state that escaped the credit crisis, the only state that never went into the red. They always stayed in the black. They had the nation's lowest unemployment rate and the lowest default rate, and the lowest foreclosure rate, I think. And according to the Wall Street Journal in 2014, the Bank of North Dakota is actually more profitable than some of Wall Street's biggest banks, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. Now, how do they do that? They're not even trying to be profitable. That's not their mandate. Their mandate is to serve the local community. But they are profitable because they cut out the middlemen. They don't have private shareholders. They don't pay bonuses, fees, or commissions. They don't have any high-paid CEOs. They don't have to advertise, because by law, all of the state's revenues are deposited in the Bank of North Dakota. And so they have a huge deposit base, and they partner with the local banks. So they don't have to set up a lot of branches, et cetera. The local bank goes out and finds a customer originally, and then the Bank of North Dakota is kind of like a banker's bank that comes in and helps with liquidity and capitalization and regulations, all that kind of stuff. And the savings are passed on to the borrowers and to the community. And today we have new rules that actually would make it easier to set up public banks. In March, the Federal Reserve opened up its discount window to all banks in good standing to borrow at 0.25%. So that's like borrow almost for free. And I believe they did that because we had a repo crisis in September of 2019, where the banks were borrowing from the repo market, and suddenly interest rates shot up to 10%, and the Fed had to save the banks by becoming the lender of last resort in the repo market. But that meant they were also saving hedge funds and other entities that weren't really there, that they weren't really supposed to be watching out for. So instead, they just said, okay, fine, we're just going to let all the banks borrow from us directly at almost nothing. And they eliminated the reserve requirement, which, what does that mean? It basically, according to a Forbes article, they said it basically means banks need not hold any reserves against their assets. They could theoretically continue making loans to infinity. They just have to make prudent loans. So how would we get, what can we do? We do want to use this crisis. Agreed, you don't want to let a good crisis go to waste, as I think Klaus Schwab said, and other, we've heard that before. I think we heard it after 9/11 or something. I mean, it might be one of these problem problem, what's it called, anywhere, they create the problem and then they come up with the solution. So we fall for their solution after they created the problem. But anyway, so what can we do? How can we turn this transition into something that actually serves the public interest? I would say, I actually wrote in my latest book, Banking on the People, that a digital network of public banks would be a good thing, including with the Federal Reserve at the top. But it's got to be a public institution. It's got to have a public mandate. But FedAccounts, in other words, allowing everybody to have an account at the central bank, and Fed coins, which would be like a digital currency issued as similar to greenbacks, it would sort of be digital greenbacks. They could all be used for good purposes. Like it would be easy to do dividend checks. We had a lot of problem with the dividend checks before. A lot of people had to wait months and never got theirs at all. So it'd be, you could do all that digitally. In other words, they're if we can capture their system, we probably can't stop them from setting up this whole digital fourth industrial revolution that they're talking about. Although I personally don't intend to, well, I won't go into that, but you know, the vaccine's an issue, but anyway, but we could turn it to good use if we can manage to get, you know, our people elected who will actually make these changes or make sure that the public interest is protected in all those things that they're doing. And for that, we need to organize, that would do like the populists did in North Dakota when they managed to get a public bank. We need to organize, educate, resist, you know, the imposition of all these totalitarian measures that we see coming at us, and try to get control of the government if we can. Anyway, assuming we can get control of the government, the system has potential. And I saw one of the questions was going to be, so I'll just address that right away. In India, they do have a system already of digital IDs, and everybody's like on their cell phone, and you get something equivalent to a, you know, like a mark you get in a supermarket, a barcode. So you get your own barcode if you're a vendor, like even if you sell oranges on the street or whatever, you can get your own barcode. And then you can have peer-to-peer digital trade where you can actually put your two barcodes together and trade from one to the other, sort of similar to a community currency. And you can do even peer-to-peer loans. So I saw where you could, like, I think it was an orange vendor. She put out her order for a loan in the morning and borrowed a little money, went out and bought the oranges and sold them and paid the loan off at the end of the day. So you can do like that, and it's all on your phone. So this whole digital concept has potential, but even in India, that's considered very controversial because we may get trapped in this digital system where we don't want them to eliminate real money, physical currency. And you can see there's a push to do that, to eliminate paper money and coins and make everything go digital. And if that happens, first of all, digital means electronic. And what happens if the grid goes down? Your money's gone. Or what if they just decide to control us through our digital, you know, they know they'll have our digital identities, they'll have our health records, they can make sure we all get our shots or whatever, and we can't have our money otherwise. I mean, they can turn us on and off at will. They can turn off the dissidents and they'll know who the dissidents are. So we've certainly seen that sort of history in totalitarian governments. And so we do need to make sure that we have protections for the public interest, but the system itself has potential if we, the public, can capture and control it. Community currencies are good. The problem is, of course, they're very limited. They're local, but they are good for local purposes, and they are always most popular during depression. So we could well be heading right into a big depression right now. So what we need to do is, like the North Dakotans did is, organize and set up cooperative local system, go local, credit should be local. Even I know there's a proposal for, it was called the NEED Act, and it was for a sort of returning to the Greenback system where the money in the US would be issued not by the Fed or by banks, but only by a central monetary authority. But how do they know how much money the system needs? And they're not going to know your local needs for loans. So that's why you need a system of local banks, ideally that was networked so that at the top, so that the local bank would have access to that deep pocket at the top, that pool of money that the central bank is able to generate as needed. But you want your local credit system that knows your local community, that can put the money where it's needed in your local community and so forth. So those are just a few ideas. These are my 3 books on the subject. So my latest is Baking on the People, but Web of Debt was actually probably it's the most popular. I spent 6 years writing it and could lavish over the imagery and so forth. And Public Bake Solutions are all about public baking. And then publicbakinginstitute.org has a lot of further information, and my website has over 300 articles, maybe 400 by now, lmbrown.com. So that's all I've got. I'll see if I can get rid of this. Stop share. There.
Well, firstly, thank you. That covered most of our questions because it was such a clear and excellent summary of a life's work that's so crucial. Thank you for so much teaching. Thank you for coming on board with us. So I suppose a lot of the questions we have already been answered. You may elucidate them a little clearer in answer. One question I was going to ask is, how has it been possible just to create money out of thin air for all this, increased welfare and corporate welfare, which is about 9 or 10 times the public welfare spending we've just seen in Australia over the COVID so-called crisis? How have we been able to just create money out of thin air?
Yeah, well, in the U.S., of course, we've had something, depending on how you count it, but $3 trillion at least, up to $8 or $9 trillion that have just been pumped into the financialized economy. First of all, we have 2 economies, the financialized economy and the real consumer producer economy. And contrary to what we have been told, the money does not trickle down from that economy to this economy. And the Federal Reserve is only able to create reserves. It is not able to just print money and spend it into the real economy. So that's actually a problem right now for the head of the Federal Reserve right now, Jerome Powell, is almost begging for the government to spend some money with, and issue some bonds so he'll have something he can buy, because that's all he's allowed to do is he can buy bonds, but he has to buy them on the open market. It's very complicated. Because of the way the Federal Reserve Act is set up, you have to go through the private banking system. They can't just go directly out to the people. But you could do that, for example, with an infrastructure bank, or change the law. I mean, I think they need to change the law and make it so, but anyway, when the government spends, it creates a debt. I mean, they either spend with taxes, but they've obviously run through their taxes. So they create in the form of bonds. They create form bonds. The Treasury issues bonds, which are then sold to these 22 big financial institutions. And they're only allowed to sell to those big banks, or some of them aren't even banks, but the primary dealers. And then the Fed has to buy, the central bank has to buy from the primary dealers or the open market, supposedly bonds that are already out there. It can't buy directly from or can't fund the Fed directly. But that's where all this money comes from, is that the the federal government just issues a lot of bonds and sells them. And the Fed has dropped the interest rate to virtually zero. So we don't have a huge interest debt, but we're still paying, I think, pretty close to half a $500 billion in interest. I mean, it is a big tab just from the previous bonds that have built up there.
In Australia, we have two proposals at the moment. One is to create a national infrastructure bank by repurposing the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Seems like a good idea. And another one is to reinstate Glass-Steagall, which divides the speculative economy from the real economy, including mortgages. And I think both of those laws need support. I think the problem is that when you've got private bankers, they just get ridiculously powerful. They just drive inequality and lack of democracy. So yeah, how do you think all this money thing relates to your upcoming elections in America?
Well, that is the problem. We don't have a real democracy in the sense that, I mean, it's really big money. The big money owns the media for starters. And so they can manipulate what people think and what people believe and what people think is really going on. But also they have the money for lobbyists and they lobby for the bills. So they got the Federal Reserve Act passed and they lobby for changes in the act that favor the banks, and big corporations can just lobby for whatever tax breaks and things that serve themselves. And that is the issue. I mean, I can't say I know the answer to that. How do we get rid of those big moneyed interests and recapture our government? But it is a lot easier to do it at the local level. For example, we had a quite vibrant movement here in California for a bill that set out a special charter for public banks, and that was passed. And these were all these very dynamic young people. I'm just so pleased to have the troops here, troops on the ground that really get out there and organize. And I'm impressed with, I've seen a lot of movements going on in Europe that we don't have going on here. But anyway, that is where things start, is at the local level. And that's where you could, for here in Los Angeles, for example, we almost got a bill passed for an LA publicly owned, city-owned bank. And again, it was these young, very dynamic young people that went and were able to form a relationship with the president of the city council. And, you can talk to your local legislators where you really, for me, for example, there's no chance of talking to Congress people or the president or anybody high up, but you could talk to your local legislators and get them to implement things.
Thank you.
The obvious. I don't really have an answer there either, but yeah.
Okay, hi. That was a brilliant summary, Ellen, of the monetary system, which is a really system. I think most people don't understand it. And I just read recently that and it's a concern I have, that the Federal Reserve in America is planning to have bank accounts for universal basic income, which will be completely digital, so people wouldn't be able to cash it in. And also this whole big push, against cash that's been going on, that I think, what you're talking about, a whole totalitarian system, is coming down very rapidly if we don't really get a grip on this and understand what it really means. Could you talk a little bit about that? And have you heard about this Federal Reserve idea or plan to do this?
Yeah, well, that's it. Those are FedAccounts. And that's what I was saying. It's got potential. It could be a good thing, but it could also be a very dangerous thing, because particularly if they cut off cash, what do you do if they decide to turn off your money? And if everything's digitized, like in the fourth industrial revolution, including us, that might be in the vaccine for, there are those who think that that's coming. then they can turn us up. Aaron Russo said that, I don't know, there was a movie called From Freedom to Fascism, 2005 by Aaron Russo. He was befriended by Nicholas Rockefeller, who was trying to get him into the Council on Foreign Relations. And so Aaron Russo said, well, you know, what's the point of all this? What are you aiming for? And Nicholas Rockefeller, this is 2005, Nicholas Rockefeller says, oh, well, the idea is to get everybody chipped, and then, you know, and then we'll have control of their money, and we can turn it off if you know, they get out of line. It's a control thing. So yeah, it's a very dangerous, it's in that sense, it's dangerous, but it also has potential. If we could get it for the public interest, it is a way to distribute, you know, I mean, I think a universal basic income actually is one possible solution to the whole debt crisis, because in order to fill up that gap between money or between debt and the money available to repay it, you've got to give the debtors some money. And you can't just write off one segment, like forgive all the student debt, because that'll make a lot of people mad, because they'll say, well, I worked hard to pay off my student debt and he got his for free. You know? I mean, you've got to do it fairly. So you've got to give everybody the same amount of money. And obviously very rich people aren't even going to care about their $1,000 a month. But to poor people, that's going to be, you know, that could be a lifesaver in this environment. But there is that danger that it's going to have, that if you do it digitally through those FedAccounts, it's a control thing. So we have to fight to insist that we want to keep access to cash, to actual physical cash for emergencies, and so that we have some independence, some ability to not have to obey the system if the rules are, you know, the rules are not good. They've already basically destroyed our constitutional rights with, I've seen it called a medical dictatorship or whatever. It seems to be it's the technocrats that medical alleged experts, but we only listen to one set of experts. We don't listen to all of them. We don't listen to the other side. It's almost like we need a court of truth, although that sounds a bit Orwellian, you know, have some, or a court of science, or have some experts from both sides that get to decide or whatever. Anyway, so the experts are coming from one position, and they obviously are funded by some big moneyed interest, and they're not unbiased experts.
The thing I didn't mention was that the Federal Reserve plans to do this, send the money to people without the congressional approval, which to me smacks of a shadow government that's in place already. You know, so they're not even, and their whole, what do you call it, the World Economic Forum, that's a private thing too. And they're talking about a great reset without, you know, governments really being involved. So that's a shocker right there.
Yeah,
so I'm a little
I
worried
agree.
about the totality.
Yeah, and then there's the
the
IMF. I forgot to mention the International Monetary Fund has proposed a new Bretton Woods, which would also be all digital, or digital central bank digital currencies. And China already has a central bank digital currency that they're actively doing, and many countries are working on them. Maybe they're all working on them, I don't know. So I imagine that's coming. And the big question is just, how do we get our, you know, get it legal, get our civil rights still built into that system? How do we prevent it from eliminating all those rights that we fought for? I mean, we fought for it in the U.S. Constitution. I'm sure you've got similar constitutional rights that your ancestors fought for.
Yeah, hi, Ellen, and speaking now. I think so many of these problems are the whole concept of growth. The word economic has been attached to the word growth and overtaken so much of our politics and public interest, whereas growth was originally something that living creatures did. And so much of this technology that we're talking about does not support living creatures, be they the individual people, organisms in the soil, or whales in the ocean. And we're seeing so many repercussions of that with climate change and loss of biodiversity, mental health problems, unemployment all around the world. We're seeing all those problems that are fully in the public eye. And what we're talking about is not so much in the public eye, as Hilary has explained. A lot of people still don't understand it. So trying to pick up on what opportunities you can see, Ellen, with this new technology that's coming through in the form of artificial intelligence. That's, you know, there's a real convergence of artificial intelligence, other technologies, biotech, 5G, cryptocurrency. How can those things be harnessed to actually support humanity and living creatures? And I will take your emphasis on doing it at the local level if you feel that's where it can be most effective. But how can artificial intelligence and these other converging technologies be used for that purpose?
Well, we can certainly use technologies for good things. But again, it's just a political issue of whether we can capture, make sure that things are done in the public interest. I mean, even just like creating a lot of extra money, people worry about, well, that's growth and that's going to mean exploitation. You know, people are going to spend on junk things and there'll be a lot of plastics around and all that stuff. But you can do infrastructure in the form of things that like invest in education and science and, you know, new ways of cleaning up the ocean, new ways of cleaning up the air. I mean, there's certainly or new energies. We certainly need some form of energy that is not, I myself am quite worried about the whole grid idea, this electrical grid, because they could turn it off or it could be hit by an asteroid. I mean, that's what you hear, that it's very vulnerable. Like when you actually, of course, there are things to be said against oil-based, gas-based cars, but at least we had independence. Like Henry Ford, when he first thought of his car system, he wanted to use biofuels. So you could go like from farm to farm, and these farms could be selling their alcohol. It's basically alcohol. Their alcohol fuels. And you'd be totally independent. So you'd be in your vehicle, burning this alcohol fuel, buying it. But now they've shut off everything. I mean, you can't even, like I saw that New York won't even let you cross the border unless you get a COVID test. And the PCR tests, of course, are totally unreliable. There are all kinds of false positives. I mean, well, anyway, you know, you can't even really travel anymore. And it sounds like that's coming, that we're going to all have to have our vaccine passports before we can travel anywhere. So you can imagine ways that technology can be used in the public interest. We don't want to stop technology, it seems to me. And ideally, we want to come up with some sort of energy source, like free energy, whatever, you know, something supposedly they're out there and they've all been suppressed. If we could recapture those, that would be great. Something that doesn't pollute the environment, but is free. Like, you know, might know more about that than I do. Hi, Helen. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. And, you know, since you've spoken at our Economics of Happiness conferences, you're very familiar with, you know, us promoting localization as a primary step. We're also encouraging the capturing of democracy. But as you're also seeing, what we see all around the world is that at the local level, precisely as you said, you know, where people can actually talk to the human scale institutions, to people in the area, you start getting the potential for real change. And we're now pretty convinced that it might be so difficult to capture the political, not just national, but it's now international global system. And that's why I would urge people right now not to bank on technology, but try to rebuild those face-to-face relationships wherever possible. Try to use, decentralized renewable energy where possible, but always banking on, realizing that when we go local, we also become aware that the real economy is the water and the earthworms, as Anne was saying. It's the life that grows that is the real economy, and that's again why we think local food is so important. So I'd love you to say a bit more about that, how you see that, because I know after you spoke at our conference in Korea, you wrote that excellent paper on agriculture. And when we look at that relationship between the money system and the soil and the living economy, I do think decentralization emerges as absolutely essential.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in this climate, you really need your neighbors. You need a community, because who knows where I live, we could be looking at riots. We could be looking at a civil war. I mean, there's so much passion around this election, and neither side is going to accept the result, no matter how it comes out. And when people don't have food, that's when historically, they'll climb walls or do whatever. And so you definitely need your local community to fall back on, to even like to get out of town or whatever happens, because we have no idea I've seen rumors of the grid collapsing or them turning off the grid on purpose, just like turning off the electricity to create chaos, because you got to destroy the old before, and then people will be begging for their system, like anything, just let me get back to normal. I'll take your vaccine, I'll take your whatever. I just want to get back to normal. If whoever the powers that be also control the media, they're able to make a case for all that looks quite reasonable to more than half the people. Although in the U.S., I think pretty close to half the people are skeptical of the whole system. But I agree. Yeah, you definitely need your local community. Now, where I live, there's no place to have a garden. And I have to say that, we can't grow local right here. This is city. But, there is, of course, a local food market. But I can't say that, I'm not sure that would be there in an emergency. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, if you have ideas, I'm all ears. What do we do in the city for our local community?
During COVID, a lot of places have shown the local supply was more reliable. And that certainly happened in many places in Japan and so on. And I hope you've seen that film, The Biggest Little Farm, that sells into LA. A beautiful example of how when you produce for the local market, you have to diversify. And so there's this link between biodiversity and local marketing. So I think we just need to push that as much as we can to see that as a fundamental lifeboat right now, but also as a necessary part of any kind of sustainable future. So, energy, what worries me is how much energy has been used essentially as part of the system to enslave us and to create these humongous global structures of trade and dependence. And that energy, of course, has ended up polluting. It's ended up being absolutely dependent on plastic, ever more plastic. So it may be that we need energy once we look in a more holistic way at a really sustainable, biodiverse future.
Yeah, that's great. I love your work, Helen.
Thank you.
I think we'd lose a lot less energy if we didn't spend so much of our money paying back interest, because money is work and resources and emissions. We're pouring out this immense enterprise and poisons in order to pay back an artificial system.
Yeah, interest and profits and just all that, their parasitic drain, that financialized drain off the top. I agree. Yeah.
We are hoping that you might think seriously of coming out here and perhaps moving here.
Yeah.
Oh, I would love to, but I can't get there. I don't think you're letting Americans in.
Up to March.
Keep your eye open. When the door opens, you might well want to consider it.
All right.
When Brand was here, he and his wife were thinking very seriously of settling here. It's a pretty special place.
Yeah, oh, it sounds great to me. I had an invitation to go live in the Seychelles, which I would have taken, but there was no way to get in there. Well, in fact, I'd go to Switzerland, which is where my daughter is, but they're not even taking Americans there. So we're stuck. I can go to Mexico.
It sounds like, oh, can I also just say, I keep trying to explain to people outside of America how many wonderful people there are in America and how many wonderful, really inspiring projects there are to demonstrate a concern for democracy, a concern for the land, a concern for the poor. And so I do feel even in LA, you know, as you said, there are these vibrant activists, these young people that really are, you know, working hard to build a better future. So it's not like America is quite as horrible as it sounds from the outside. I think that's important to share.
Yeah, well, and I've read that, you know, we have this whole thing about individuality and freedom and, you know, freedom to, and so that could be a bad thing, but it's also counter to this whole digital totalitarian system that's about to be imposed on us. And so they've kind of targeted America because they got to get rid of all those individualists that think that they think for themselves and have free will. They got to get rid of free will for starters.
Can I just say something? I want to ask you about the, they want to get rid of the reserve status of the dollar. Are you, do you have any ideas about that? Because I've been reading a lot about.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
The reserve dollar, you know, the U.S. has the reserve, is the reserve currency of the world right now. And there are plans from all the readings I've been doing that they want to take that away and maybe via a global digital currency, which would create an enormous problem for America at this stage. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, that was the new Bretton Woods of you know, of the IMF. The idea would be right now the IMF issues SDRs, which are, you know, an artificially created unit that you can trade with. But the original Bretton Woods, at the original Bretton Woods conference, Keynes suggested using the Bancor, or, you know, creating this unit of account that would be the reserve account between countries. And that didn't happen, but there is a Bancor digital currency, but it's not the same thing. But anyway, you know, I agree. We need some sort of, here was my proposal that I put out in Web of Debt. You need some sort of unit. You need a yardstick to compare currencies. And right now it means that third world countries, their currencies are easily short sold or whatever, you know, it's easy for them to be manipulated by the big moneyed interest and to collapse their, well, like Venezuela and Zimbabwe and all that, when they went into hyperinflation, it's because the speculators come in and short sell the currency and drive it down. And it's fairly easy to do because it's all compared to these big currencies that are the reserve currencies, not just the dollar, but the British pound and so forth. But it seems to me you do need a yardstick, some way to compare the value of different currencies. So what you could have, I would use the consumer price index. So take a basket of things or things that every country uses or spends or whatever, including housing, because you've already got this CPI or the consumer price index that's figured for every country. And then figure out what it costs. Like you have this basket of things that are essentials for living, figure out what it costs in each currency. And then, you know, like it might take 4 pesos to, or it's probably more like 20 pesos to buy what $1 would buy. 20 pesos might buy that same basket in Mexico. So then it's automatic when you go across borders with your credit card or your card or whatever, it'll automatically know what the exchange rate is because it's measured against some independent basket. I've seen people suggest a basket of metals, but that doesn't seem very fungible. I mean, it seems to me you should throw in food and housing and the things that people need. But I mean, we do definitely need some sort of different system. And now that we have computerization, it wouldn't be that difficult to do, but you need some economists that are totally not bought off to figure that out and how it can be done.
I would argue that that should never be figured out without ecologists at the table having equal voice and equal power. And from our point of view, the reason why these so-called third world governments can be manipulated is because their labor price has been kept low, starting with slavery, and that it suits their elites in the global marketplace to be able to sell their labor and their products cheaply, so they have a comparative advantage. So to me, it's absolutely key. And I'd love to work with you, Ellen. You know, I'm coming from the more ecological cultural side. I think, you know, you and I, anyway, I'd like to do like a podcast with you soon, because I think we really do need that holistic approach to look at what kind of system could really work in interest of survival. You know, this is biodiversity is now, as we speak, being extinguished while tons of money are being created artificially. And there's a link between those two relationships. And so I think the system using the computer, the standard system, is actually not what we want. We want a democratic process to understand that we need to maintain the diversity and that there should be a much more decentralized way of linking money as a token of value to the real economy. So it's more complicated, but I think it's pretty easy to figure out how the decentralizing process is absolutely essential for the real wealth, the ecological, you know, biodiversity, the water, the soil, and human beings and their diversity. I hope that makes sense to you, Ellen. I'm sure it does.
Yeah, I have a little, some parts got lost, but I think I know, I'd love to work with you. Yes, that would be great.
One last question.
Yes, and I think what localization has really taught me too is that once people become familiar with it, they lose their attachment to money as a store of value. You know, like you're saying, so many people will say, yeah, I'll agree to vaccines and being implanted if it means I can't get my money. What localization actually does is weaken that connection between that human sense of security and well-being to money. And it creates this other localized version of self and you know what life is about, that's linked to the natural world and to living things, and it puts the role of money and economics back within that broader framework, which is so much healthier for everyone.
And it was
Yeah,
our community, especially that people feel that the richest part of their life is having that community and having that support, which then provides the security, which makes them stronger and able to say no to the pressures from above.
And we do have a barter system set up in this area, which obviously will need to be much more used. It already is, but I'm sure it will when the crunch comes. Do you have any timeline? Has Martin Armstrong, for example, indicated when he thinks cashless society will come in?
Well, I don't know. The World Economic Forum is meeting in January, and I think they're planning to, you know, they already set the thing up last, was it July, or they met, you know, had a small meeting, where they had some big names met and set stuff up, and they've got their whole website all designed. I think it is, coming in the spring probably, but
I think it's also important to mention that as part of that top-down system, climate and carbon are a central part of it, and that they do want to use blockchain and the digital currency to also impose an order on how you measure carbon. And they say that's right, ordinary people can't measure carbon. We're going to need drones linked to satellites and robots doing the farming. So it's quite a horrific picture. And I think, it's so sad that people don't know about the truth of most of these things. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlement, I didn't even know about for about 20 years of my work. When I was raising awareness about this global system, I didn't know how central the BIS was, which is, now it's there. People can look it up. It's the fact of its existence. But still, if you try to talk about it, people think you're talking conspiracy, like you're making it up, like that building doesn't exist in Basel. And what does it mean, for people? So I do feel you're playing such an important role, Ellen, and I really hope you keep going strong and that we can collaborate more.
Oh yeah, you are too, Helena. Thank you very much. And it's great relating to your group. I do wish I was there in person. That would be super. I would love to live in an intentional community. I live in a senior village. Let me tell you about the mentality of people here. So we have this one vacant lot that the chairman of the board at the time, where there were several men on the board who wanted to put in some more condominiums there, and that's what they wanted to use the lot for. And they took the trees down. They took down like 10 trees off this lot, which was quite appalling. And then they didn't know. And then the residents voted down putting in the condominiums. And so at a board meeting, I said, well, how about if we plant fruit trees? And the first response was, oh, but people would steal the fruit. Well, of course they'd steal the fruit. That's the whole idea, is that you would be able to walk by and pick a pear or pick an orange or something like that. I don't know. I saw that's Yugoslavia, I think, had a very good socialist system where people just planted fruit trees along the road just for the fun of it. And then you could go along and pick a fruit if you wanted fruit. It's not like you picked a bushel of them and sold them. You just picked one because you wanted to eat it. I don't know. But that is, we've got a huge mindset problem where you're up against this, or even just this whole vaccine issue. We've got so much dissension. These are breaking up, and best friends, and things are falling apart so that major.
We also raise awareness about the social dilemma and the experts who are really spelling out how with the social media we're getting polarized, and the middle ground, the common sense middle ground message doesn't get out, and so we need to do everything we can for that. What I call big picture activism, which tries to spell out the holistic picture, which is the middle ground where we could come together.
Well, this has been great, just relating to you all. It makes me, I wish I could go there.
Well, it's been really wonderful having you, Ellen. And yes, we are quite a strong group of women here. I wonder if we can set up some sort of barter system or some kind of alternative currency just for our area. I think that might be needed soon. Thank you so much for your wisdom and for taking.
Thank you.